Well, welcome to episode 432 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and this is the 8th installment of my series Jazz Under the Radar. And in each installment of this series, I highlight 10 LPs which may have slipped from view in recent times, but in my view are well worth your time to seek out. Now, I always point out at the beginning of these episodes that these are not necessarily budget items. They may be hard to find, particularly in their early issues, but there should still be some vinyl versions available. And if not, well, then you can stream it and decide how badly you want to chase it. And as for how I determine a record is under the radar, well, it's a little bit arbitrary. I tend to focus on records which are by artists not very well known these days, or by a well-known artist for whom this is a real left turn, stylistically or artistically. And then every now and then I cheat and include a record which might be quite well known, but I want to talk about anyway. I think there's one of those later on here. As always, experienced collectors are going to know some of these, but I hope for everybody watching there are at least some surprises. Anyway, here we go, 10 more records that fly under the radar. Now, the first record I want to talk about is this one. It's by Bobby Troup, and this is not a record that I necessarily would have sought out or picked up until a few years ago. It's called The Distinctive Style of Bobby Troup. It came out on Bethlehem in 1957. Now, most of my life, I've known Bobby Troup as the guy who had the writing credit on the rock and roll hit Route 66. And of course, you probably know the Stones version of that, the Chuck Berry version, and so on. And I assume that he was probably some kind of obscure pop star from the early 1960s. And he did have a bit of a pop career, but fundamentally, he was essentially a reasonably well-established jazz artist in the 1950s and 1960s. Incidentally, he was also married to the singer Julie London, and the two of them, here's some trivia, starred in the LA-based TV series Emergency in the early 1970s. Anyway, the reason I came across Bobby Troup again in the first place was that a few years ago, around 2000, I became infatuated with picking up releases by the small California label called Mode, which only put out records during the summer and fall, I think it was, of 1957. I'll talk about one of those Mode releases a little later on in this video. They had wonderful cover art, they were wonderfully recorded, they had great music. Tragically, the label went under after only a few months. Now, I've tried to gather as many of those as I can, and I got Bobby Troup's outing, and I was actually pretty favorably impressed by that. So I thought, well, maybe I can get some other records of his from around the same time. And I picked this one up a little while ago. And truth be told, it has an absolutely terrible cover. If the art on Mode records was sublime, this one looks a little bit like a police sketch artist's version of a guy who's been hanging around the ladies' washroom at the community center. But don't let the cover art stop you. The music on here is fantastic. It's an album of wonderfully delivered standards, all sung by a guy who's got real control of his instrument. In a word, this record is charming. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this one. It is Nice and Tasty by the John Wright Trio. It came out originally in 1960 on Prestige. My version came out a few years later. Prestige had this low-budget reissue label, which still sounds pretty good to my ears, called Status, or Status if you want. I'll just show you the labels here, which are, there you are. These orange labels, kind of low budget looking. But again, the sound is pretty good. Now, I had previously reviewed another record by the John Wright Trio on the channel, another one he made for Prestige, called South Side Soul. I have a hard time saying that one, which was then redone by OJC. It's very hard to find originals. That's a terrific record. And in total, he made 5 for Prestige. This one, that one, and then 3 others that he made under his own name, but all 5 are piano trio records. This one is accompanied by some kind of unusual liner notes by the late jazz critic Joe Goldberg, who I think kind of gratuitously savages some other piano players who weren't on here at all, people like Bobby Timmons and Les McCann, and he calls them derivative or words to that effect. The implication, I guess, being that John Wright is not derivative. Well, I don't have such finely tuned ears that I can dismiss Bobby Timmons or Les McCann or some of the other people that he savages as being derivative, but what I can say is that John Wright is an exceptional talent. Wright's music was soul jazz. It was bluesy, it was emotional, it was moving. Now, with the decline in the popularity of soul jazz in the mid-1960s, a lot of artists who kind of cut their teeth playing that, or hard bop, people like Stanley Turrentine, Donald Byrd, or others, kind of reinvented themselves for the late 60s and early 1970s. Wright was somebody who didn't do that. He stuck to his guns. He kept playing the music that he wanted to play, and as a consequence, not really because of any lack of quality on his part, just because of changing tastes, he kind of fades from view and he returns back to the Chicago club scene, and he remains for the rest of his life a hugely valued and treasured member of the Chicago music community, but he never really made much more impact on record. Still, it's quite something to be revered on the Chicago music scene if you know anything about the quality of the music in that city. Anyway, this is very typical of his records. It's evocative of mid-century Chicago jazz, I would say, in general. It boasts a seductively bluesy track list. It's played to a high rhythmic and technical standard, lots of invention, recommended. The next record I wish to discuss is this one. It's a self-titled effort by Warne Marsh. It comes out on Atlantic in 1958. I have a much later reissue on, well, theoretically not Atlantic, but it's actually, I think, one of those Scorpio reissues, which are of suspect provenance, let's just say, necessary because getting an original is actually pretty pricey. Your best bet for this one, however, is actually a Japanese reissue from the 1970s. Those are the only, I think, properly sourced, legit reissues since 1958. Marsh, again, is a guy who's somewhat faded from view. He was a well-regarded tenor player. He's pretty much associated with the cool school. He was an acolyte of Lenny Tristano, along with people like Lee Konitz. But for a guy with a lot of talent, he has a fairly slim discography. He makes this one for Atlantic. He also had a co-led effort with Konitz a couple of years before. There's a handful of other records he makes in the 1950s as a leader, and then he goes pretty quiet until the 1970s, even as a sideman. At that point, he reemerges with what I've always thought is kind of an odd outfit called Super Sax, which was this group which kind of played these orchestrally arranged versions of Charlie Parker solos. Now, speaking as somebody who thinks quite a bit about jazz history, when a jazz musician who's quite popular in the 1950s goes silent for nearly a decade and a half, you usually kind of assume there may have been some what you might call refueling issues there. But it's not really clear that Marsh, who did use drugs now and then, had that much of a problem. So it's kind of a mystery. I'm not really in any position to opine on all of that. What I will just say is that it's a shame he didn't leave more evidence of his talent. This, as I say, is his second record for Atlantic, which was still in the mid to late 1950s, establishing itself as a serious jazz label. It is cool flavored bop, but not bluesy, much more of the kind of the other stream, the cooler stream influence on bop music. It has also, I think, a gloriously unstudied feel to it. This record kind of makes you feel like you just dropped into a loft party in Manhattan sometime in the later 1950s. It's also a little bit odd as a record in that the very first track on side one begins with a bass solo. The lineup's a quartet, and it's a pretty high gear quartet. He's supported on drums by either Philly Joe Jones or by Paul Motian. Jones, of course, was playing with Davis around this time. Paul Chambers is on bass, but the piano player is a little bit more obscure. It's a guy called Ronnie Ball. He was an English guy. He too was a student of Tristano's, and he shows up playing with and recording with Marsh in the 1950s, but that's really the only trace that he left. As I say, it's very hard to find an original of this. The 1958 pressings are quite rare and quite expensive. So once again, rather than this American undated Scorpio pressing, I would recommend seeking out a Japanese press. Now, I said I was going to talk about one of those mode records from 1957 with the fantastic painted covers, and here is one. It's by the Herbie Harper Sextet, and it's titled the Herbie Harper Sextet. Many of the finest records to come out of LA in the 1950s differ from their East Coast counterparts in that their influences are slightly more big band than they are blues or bebop, and this is an example of that. I don't want to make too much of that. I think the difference is slight, and in no way do I want to say that these records don't swing, because they absolutely do. This one, as I say, is a great example. Herbie Harper, now pretty much obscure today, provides us with his wonderfully tight, infectious program of music with some great sidemen. It's one of those mode releases from 1957 with the paintings signed there by Ava Diana. Here's a picture of her. Harper himself was a slide trombone player. He was quite well known in West Coast jazz circles in the 1950s. As a leader, he has a small flurry of records in the 1950s, and then he reappears again as a leader in the 80s. But as a sideman, he worked pretty much constantly from the 1940s through the 1980s. His sidemen here include some pretty familiar names, certainly West Coast circles like Howard Roberts on guitar, the great Marty Paich, the great arranger and piano player, well, more great as an arranger than as a piano player, but he holds his own here on piano, and Red Mitchell on bass, and the drums are shared by either Frankie Capp or Mel Lewis. There is one real unknown on here, a guy called Jay Corey on tenor sax, and I think this is his only actual recording credit. And I'm not going to say that he blows everybody away, but he certainly doesn't let the team down. Anyway, as I say, this is one of those great mode releases from 1957. Everything about this record is first class, so grab it if you see it. Now, staying with the West Coast, here is another record which is certainly worth grabbing if you can find it, whether in an original pressing or in some later variation. If you've watched this channel long enough, you've heard me talk now and then about the scene at the Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach, which is just south of LA, or I guess maybe within LA County anyway. I'm sure LA people can correct me. It's about a 40-minute Uber south of Hollywood on the beach. And the Lighthouse Cafe was pretty much ground zero for West Coast jazz, at least in performance terms, in the early to mid-1950s, particularly for those musicians graduating from the big bands of Woody Herman and Stan Kenton. Howard Rumsey, he is the bass player at the very right-hand end of the picture, persuaded the owner of the Lighthouse Cafe, which is actually about 100 yards from where this picture is taken on the beach. He persuaded him to regularly feature jazz, and Rumsey committed to be the guy that organized the performances. And the list of musicians who cycled through the Lighthouse over the next decade is fairly incredible for a little club which is some distance from the bright lights of Hollywood on a quaint but, inauspicious stretch of waterfront. In addition to Rumsey is the impresario. Other performers at the Lighthouse in the 1950s included Max Roach, Victor Feldman, Stan Levy, Shorty Rogers, Shelley Mann, Conte Candoli, Sonny Clark, Art Pepper, Hampton Hawes, and lots of other folks. Jerry Mulligan played there, Miles Davis played there, Chet Baker played there, and the best part is, it's still there, and it still pretty much looks exactly as it was. It hasn't had a major makeover. The wood paneling is the same. It looks just like it does in the photographs from the era. And they still do a jazz jam on Monday nights, and I think also a jazz brunch on Sundays. So Rumsey manages to get himself a record deal at Contemporary Records shortly after he'd established himself organizing these concerts at the Lighthouse, and shortly after Contemporary itself was started up as a label. So in the same way that Jerry Mulligan's group with Chet Baker was the launch pad for Pacific Records, because they both kind of came to be at the same time, so Rumsey's Lighthouse group was the impetus, or maybe the fuel, for Les Koenig's Contemporary Records around the same time. One of those nice pieces of serendipity. What Rumsey offered Contemporary was a regular supply of high-quality jazz with which they could populate their early releases. All that is a roundabout way of saying there are quite a few Howard Rumsey records on Contemporary. There were a bunch of 10-inch releases up to 1954. Some of those were reissued as an expanded 12-inch later on. There's some original 12 inches as well. This one, as it says here, is volume 6. Frankly, they're all pretty good. This one, I think, is my personal favorite. The music is great. Not much to pick and choose, I would say, in terms of the music between these different releases. But this is to the same high standard. I also just love the cover art on this one because it's so evocative of that moment and the location. Also because I can just imagine these guys in their 1950s baggy suits hauling their instruments down to the sand just so Bill Claxton could get this shot. Incidentally, there is one version of this record which has a blue cover. I don't think the music is any different or anything else about the format is different except the label is greenish. Kind of fun if you can find that one. The music is pretty solidly bop. It's recorded in 3 dates over the winter of 1954 and 1955. Everybody's good here. Don't get me wrong. These are all top-ranked musicians. Stan Levy's on here, Rumsey, Bud Shank on alto sax. But Conte Candoli on trumpet, I think, for me, is the real standout. The track list also has lots of variety in terms of feel and pace. It's just a really good record. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this record by a name that's probably unfamiliar to most viewers. It's by Billy Byers. It comes out on RCA in 1956, and it's called The Jazz Workshop. It's also a record which, and I suppose this is true of almost every record, some will like more than others. This is Byers' debut as a leader. He was a mainstay in Hollywood in the 1950s and 1960s. He was a trombonist, and he has a few records of his own, like this one, which he leads. But for the most part, he made his name as a sideman and particularly as an arranger and conductor. And he's got a lot of credits for writing and arranging, I think nearly 400, a lot of those for film and TV soundtracks. And as you might expect from somebody with that kind of pedigree, and who's actually on the front cover here conducting, at least I think he's conducting, he might also be giving a university lecture, who knows. This is the kind of record which leans more heavily on arrangement and composition, kind of the polar opposite of a prestige blowing session. But although there are quite a number of musicians on here, I wouldn't necessarily call this a big band record. It's more of a record that has parts for many different instruments. So if you like for instance, Gil Evans' work for Impulse, I think you'll like this record too. It is about the skills of the composer and the arranger, but it's not a precious record. It still swings. It's also a record which is wonderfully recorded. I would say impeccably recorded. I played it back just before I made this video, and I was struck again by just how crystalline some of the sound was. When I bought this record, it was kind of on a whim. It's kind of a gamble. I really didn't know much about him, but I thought, well, from an interesting era. And when I first heard it, I thought, okay, as I was getting into it, is this going to be some kind of cerebral George Russell affair? Is it going to kind of leave me cold? It does not. It really, really drew me in. And I think what you'll find if you listen to this is and this may kind of be a strange or obvious thing to say, it's a great listening record in that there are certain records that you sometimes just want to sit down and focus on and pick out different pieces. And this is one. Very rewarding on repeated listens, and I recommend it to you. A change of pace now, talk about a record which came out in 1967 on the CTI sub-imprint of A&M. That was Creed Taylor's project within A&M originally, which eventually then became Creed Taylor Incorporated. This is by Tamba 4. It's called We in the Sea, and I'd like to say right off the bat that this is probably not what you may be expecting, which is just another commercial bossa nova effort from the late 1960s. Not that there's anything wrong with commercial bossa nova efforts from the late 1960s, but this is not that. Tamba 4 was a group which evolved from an earlier Brazilian group called Tamba Trio, which was a very, very talented multi-instrumentalist group of Brazilian musicians who did really interesting arrangements of bossa nova standards in the mid-1960s. For those of you who are fans of the beautiful game, if you remember the 1998 World Cup, there was a famous ad, which I loved. I remember thinking this was so cool, I think by Nike, which featured the Brazilian national team, Ronaldo, real Ronaldo, and all the rest of them, Roberto Carlos, etc., playing soccer in an airport, and it was set to Tamba Trio's version of Mas Que Nada. The original lineup of the Tamba Trio included the pianist Luiz Essa, the bassist Bebeto, and the drummer Elcio Milito. In 1967, two of those, Essa and Bebeto, along with two other musicians, signed as Tamba 4 with Creed Taylor's CTI. And they released two records, of which this is the first. Now, neither of those records did very well at all, probably because they weren't paint-by-numbers, pop-oriented bossa nova like Sergio Mendes was doing. What they were doing, for the most part, was taking well-established bossa nova standards by Tom Jobim and other composers and turning them into hugely original interpretations. So on this record, an early example of that is the first track, O Moro. It's called The Hail here, but that's just a translation of the Brazilian title, O Moro. That's a bossa nova standard. It's a Tom Jobim composition, and it's an interesting choice because it's one of Jobim's very few compositions that actually has some kind of a political theme. Recall, of course, that Brazil at this point was under a dictatorship, and this is now being recorded for the first time on an American label, not a Brazilian label, so maybe they're trying to get away with more as an indirect criticism of the regime than they might otherwise have been able to do in Brazil. Their treatment of O Moro is very different. It's got a very gentle, familiar, melancholy melody. They deconstruct it repeatedly and then build the song back up again, and it ends with that most rare of things, a bossa nova drum solo. Anyway, with the passage of time, I think people have come to appreciate this record as something other than yet another bossa nova cash-in. What it really is a serious jazz record, albeit one with bossa nova sensibilities, and I encourage you to seek it out. The next record I want to talk about comes out in 1956 on Imperial Records, which was a small, I think, LA label. It's by Sonny Criss, and it's called Jazz U.S.A. So after Rollins and Stitt, Sonny Criss is probably the least famous of the three mid-century saxophone Sonnies. There may be others. Perhaps I've forgotten somebody. Anyway, he's less famous than they are. But he was a wonderfully fluid alto sax player. Like all alto sax players in the late 40s and early 50s, he was heavily influenced by Charlie Parker, but he developed a style which was much more of his own, more flowing, more gentle than Parker to my ears, but still very impressive technically. His path as a musician was fairly typical. He went through Billy Eckstine's orchestra in the 1940s. That was the same path that people like Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis and Art Blakey had taken on their path to stardom. He then played in Stan Kenton's influential big band in the early 1950s, and that was his springboard to emerge in the mid-1950s as a standalone leader of jazz records. Although, while he made quite a few records at this point, they were typically for labels that you might call more marginal, like Imperial, this one, Regent, Crown, and Brunswick. He found stardom elusive, perhaps because he was, and I would say unfairly so, written off as a Charlie Parker clone. That happened to a lot of alto players in the 1950s. In the early 60s, he then moved to Europe for a while, as did a lot of jazzmen. When he comes back to America in 1966, he signs with Prestige, so finally he's with a well-known jazz label. Sadly, it was when his art form, bebop, was really declining in terms of public interest. But nevertheless, that run of records that he made on Prestige, including a fantastic record that he made with Horace Tapscott, which recently got the Kevin Gray OJC treatment. I think it came out a couple of weeks ago. That run of records is probably his best-known run of records. This one, however, is from that early run of records on Imperial. It's got some impressive sidemen. Kenny Drew is on piano, and the guitarist Bernie Kessel is here, providing some kind of surf-sounding licks at points. In a word, the main descriptor I would use for this record is effortless. Criss's playing just flows across the whole record. I would say that the first and last tracks are probably the weakest, so don't give up after the first track. The sidemen are very strong, but just to be clear, Criss is the real star of this record. Have a look for it. Now, I said I was going to cheat and talk about a record that's maybe a bit better known. So here it is. It's this record, Don't Go to Strangers by Etta Jones. It came out on Prestige in 1960, and this is nothing other than a superb vocal jazz record. You have an extremely talented singer backed up by a muscular band of sidemen, which includes Roy Haynes on drums, the wonderfully talented Frank West on flute and saxophone, George Duvivier on bass, Skeeter Best on guitar, and Richard Wyans on piano. This record was nominated for a Grammy in 1960. It was subsequently put into the Grammy Hall of Fame in, I think, 2008, 2009, for whatever that's worth. In fact, I think the Grammy people were feeling a little bit guilty about Etta Jones because she was nominated for a Grammy for her work in 1960, in 1981, and 1999 without ever winning. That's a remarkable stretch of time. Anyway, given all of that, it's probably a bit of a stretch to say this record or this artist is under the radar, but I would say that the generation which knew her best as a singer, well, most of them are not necessarily around anymore, and I think she deserves a new audience, and that's why I'm including this record. And I'm doing that because unlike Ella, unlike Billie Holiday, unlike Sarah Vaughan, Etta Jones doesn't always get mentioned in the first rank of jazz singers, but take it from me, she is in that first rank. On here, there are a lot of highlights. Hard to pick one out, but I have to say the title track, Don't Go to Strangers, is superb, as is her version of Fine and Mellow, which Billie Holiday made famous. And a word, too, about Frank West. This is a guy who, in addition to his own excellent work, also had a wonderful career as an accompanist, and he did great work with Etta Jones. He also does some fantastic work over the years with the jazz harpist Dorothy Ashby. His playing on this record is absolutely glorious, and I almost think that on a jazz vocal record, having the secondary instrument which features is really important because, I may be alone in this, but I do find that if you have a very stripped down accompanying band and you're really featuring the voice over and over and over, say 10 to 12 tracks, you get a little bit of fatigue hearing the same person. It's that beautiful contrast, and West provides that not just through his flute, but also through his tenor playing. So those three different sounds weave together here to make this an extremely listenable and just hugely pleasant record to put on. Etta Jones' vocals are excellent, but Frank West just elevates this record every time he enters the scene. So anyway, that's, I guess, what I think about this one. Pick it up if you can. Now, this last record I want to talk about is by Chico Hamilton. It's called The Master. It comes out on the Stax record sub-imprint Enterprise in 1974. And this is a record which I heard for the very first time just the other day. I had a good friend, my friend Sean, who was visiting from Ontario, and he and I went crate digging. Anyway, we found this in a local record shop. Neither of us had ever heard of it. Perhaps not so strange that I hadn't heard of it, but my friend Sean has 4 times as many LPs as I do, and he knows his stuff, particularly jazz, and he hadn't heard of it either. So we asked the guy in the record store, can you put this on? So he does, and we are both just blown away by the sound that comes out of the speakers. It's a collaboration with the band Little Feat, all of the members of Little Feat circa 1973-74, except obviously for the drummer, because Chico Hamilton is a drummer. It's a super funky outing because Little Feat was heading in a very funky direction at that time. They were also very jazz forward at points in their evolution. Chico on drums is accompanied by at least one, and I think at times 2 conga players. So the rhythm of this, just the funkiness of this is overwhelming. The record is, I think, to be fair, basically extended jazz, for better or worse, but the soloing is kept, I think, to a tasteful minimum, and this allows Chico's very intense, very taut drum track to come to the fore. Anyway, we both loved it. I ended up being the guy that purchased it, but then in one of those weird coincidental things that sometimes happen when you're out shopping for records, in the very next store, Sean then found his own copy, and neither of us had ever seen this record before in our lives. So I guess you can call that a dual endorsement, and I wish you the best in finding your own copy. So there we have it. The 8th installment of Jazz Under the Radar is in the books. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, I look forward to hearing your comments and recommendations in the comment section below. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.